Hey, it's Angelica with Creative Angelic Images, and today I'm going to be very fast kind of walking you through an edit that I did, specifically this robot edit. So if you want to continue to understand how I did it, just keep watching. As I go through and I start to work on composite pieces, I always have an idea of when I first begin. And as you're seeing right now, what I'm doing is I'm taking the pen tool and I'm going around and I'm tracing the robot that I'm going to be using primarily in the robot aquarium composite piece. But as I go through, I always tend to have an idea of what it is that I want to do prior to actually doing it. At least for the main center of what my photo is going to look like. And then as I start getting into my photos, sometimes it has to change. For me as an artist, that was one of the very first things that I learned for myself, is that I have to allow, you could say, room for growth within the image itself. Okay. And I love to use masks a lot. Like you're seeing right now, what I'm doing is I'm actually tracing and masking out like the gears and the stuff of the robot, because obviously I don't want the robot parts. I just want the body and the essential, figure for it, but I want to place the aquarium inside of his body, in his for part of his torso and his arms. As you can see though, I'm not, doing it very precise, because that's going to be done actually later in the edit. I just want a little bit of the outline, so where I could still see where the outline is, because when I want everything to kind of fit inside the image, then I still want the shadow and still want the highlights, because essentially it's still on a black background, okay? Because I want the aquarium to be a black background. A lot of my pieces that I use are public domain images, or are free. They're not copyright, so they're free for commercial or personal use. I use specifically unsplash.com. They have amazing artists with their photography and stuff, and I love to use it. So right now what I'm going through is I'm just grabbing some of the certain pictures that specifically that I want to include, and I'm just literally taking the lasso tool and quickly like drawing a lasso around what I want, kind of cutting and pasting into a new as a new layer into the document, and then a lot of times I'm renaming that layer then too. Okay. After I get kind of all the different things that I want, what I do is then I will go in and I'll be like, okay, I have an idea, like, oh, the image can go over here on the right side, or no, maybe it's not going to work over on the right side, maybe it's going to work on the left side. Like I said, I have an idea of, hey, I want to use this particular foliage in this particular part of the image. But I still have to be, you could say, open for negotiation of how the image is going to look. I may go, hey, I think it would look great being a multiply effect for the filters on the side. But you know what? Maybe multiply wouldn't work. Maybe I have to do like hard light or soft light, okay? So the biggest thing is that like I will have an idea as I go through it, but then my ideas sometimes will get altered. Okay. As you can see, when I do masking, I do very quick masking. It'll be like, oh, I want certain parts of this kept, or I want other parts completely gone. Regardless of the situation, like I said, I'm very flexible. What I absolutely love is I'm working right now through Affinity Photo. I've been turned on to Affinity Photo recently. I've used Photoshop for pretty much most of my career as a graphic artist, and I still use Photoshop yet to today, but I like Affinity Photo. I like some of the things that it can do. It kind of is like the cross between Lightroom and Photoshop kind of together. I like some of the availabilities that it has that may be a little bit different than Photoshop. It's pretty much, you could say, if you want Photoshop to have a competition, Affinity Photo would definitely be it. Affinity's not paying me to say this or anything like that. I really like the program. I love the features that it has. I still like to use Photoshop, yes. But for me right now, Affinity is just kind of like being the thing that that works. You know what I mean? But as you can see now, what I'm going through is I'm just kind of masking out areas that I want, getting specific blend-in effects. The big thing is that be very careful with lines. Make sure to always increase the size of your, as you're working with your photos, increase the size of it to make sure that you have seamless lines. If you start to see shadows in areas that are not specifically to be shadows, then it's going to kind of look a little bit off. A lot of people have asked me questions like, when did I begin graphic design? When did I, who taught me? How did I learn it? To answer those questions, because I've had people DM me those questions, I have actually been doing graphic design, oh my goodness, for I would say probably at least 20 years almost right now. I was doing composite work, or what I would call blends. But now it's called composite work by a lot of individuals. I was doing things like this back 20 years ago when a lot of people maybe weren't doing it as much as they would like to. I was, of course, a teenager doing it and not wanting to do my homework when I was in school, and I would just spend sometimes, hours and hours and hours on weekends just focusing on trying to get a composite piece absolutely perfect. Okay. Now, on average, when I do composite work, it depends on the situation. It could take me anywhere between, 1 to 2 hours. On average, you could say that from start to finish, I will be done with a composite piece within a 2 to 3 hour time frame. Obviously, we're not going to be going 2 to 3 hours, here. You're just seeing a very quick edit and availability for me to do it. Okay. So as I go through and I start actually doing composite work, what I will be doing is I'll start to get all the layers kind of down of where I want it, and I will do a little bit of masking of the layers, and I'll do a little bit of blending in on the side with the different channels and stuff like that. But then once I'm done kind of getting everything situated, then I will go in and actually get massively into color correction, okay? Now, if I want to start you could say my piece out with massive color shift or color correction, then I may start that with like my center point of what my piece is going to be, and I'll color correct that right away. But traditionally, I don't get into color correction until the end. I would rather get everything kind of situated the way that I would like to see it, and then I get it then I start masking things out that I don't really want, and get to being what looks like, you could say, kind of like a hot mess for a sec. In this situation. But as you can see, it's very much pay attention to detail. So right now what I'm doing is I'm masking out all that, you could say, cleaning up the rough edges, right? I want to clean those rough edges up. I want it to not look like a hot mess, basically. But as you see, as I go through doing it, you have to get the different layers and stuff, because sometimes I have to mask out a different layer. Great thing about masking is it's a non-destructive way of working with the layer. It's not like you're using the eraser brush or anything, because when you erase part of the image, then you lose part of that image. Like, perfect example right here is, I erased a little bit too much of the cheek and I wanted to put it back, so then I literally just changed the color from black to white to just re-add back in, right? Okay. So remember, black is going to hide, white's going to reveal, okay? So I use the black to kind of hide the areas, all right? Now that I've kind of masked out the areas and have it kind of the way that I want, if you look, now it's like, I mask a little bit too much because I want some of that 3D effect. So I want some of that lighting to be kind of on the outside of my image with the outline of the robot. So now I'm going back in and I'm just adding it right back in, right? So making sure that my image actually has more of the highlights and the shadows. It's light that works for an image. It's the highlights, it's the shadows. Those are the two big things, okay? You can take pretty much almost anything and blend it together as long as the light either matches or it makes sense, okay? So no matter what you kind of do, you have to have things kind of like make sense. So now, as you're seeing with this, as I'm going through and I'm changing the different colors and trying to change like the feel of like the aquarium situation and make it more realistic, I have to pay attention to certain areas when it comes to light, going, okay, the light is hitting it here, does that make sense? Okay, yep, it makes sense. Now I can add a little bit more shadow over here because maybe it'll make sense more over there. Okay. As you're seeing, what I'm doing right now is I'm going through, and it's presets that I have made of specific gradient filters of effects that I know that will add to the photo the way that I want the photo to be added. Primarily, those are the same effects that I use on every single photo of one version or another. Um, when I start to get towards the end of a blend, then that's where, or a composite work, that's where I really start to pay attention to small details. So as you can see with this image, it doesn't make sense to have a little bit of that light right on top of um, you could say where it's still really light on top of like that collarbone area. So what I'm trying to do then is I'm using like clone tool to kind of fill in it with shadow where it's the same shadow and texture is further up there. So I'll go through, what I'll do is I'll make a stamp or like a visual stamp of all the layers underneath it. Then I go through and then I'll adjust, you could say adjust that, and then I'll use like the smudge tool sometimes to add just a little bit of that blend to it too. And now most of my images I always will use like a curves adjustment layer, and I just kind of go by wanting to darken the darks and lightening up the lights. Okay. Then a lot of times when you have everything completely in focus, right, you know, you have to adjust your depth of field. So I will add blur to something, I'll maybe add sharpen to something. That's just common things that I always will use. And then I do finishing touches. Now, when I will mask out blurring areas, I'll like do an entire blur of the entire area, and then I will go in, and how I mask it is I will have a very, you could say, strong opacity of a brush, and I'll like erase the parts that I want specifically to be way in focus, and then the areas around it I will then keep lowering the opacity of it. Because if you think about it, like when you're taking a picture of something, you want a specific set of depth of field, so, and it will kind of widen as it goes out. Okay, but that's how I do it. So hopefully you like it. Let me know.